I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be here talking to the one and only Brandon Sanderson, the author of, I don't know, 1 million books, I would say.
50-something.
Okay, close enough. But today I'm here to talk about the next book in the Stormlight Archive, Wind and Truth. What does it feel like to be putting out this part of the story?
There's a lot there, a lot of emotions. I'll mention a spoiler warning ahead. I'm going to try not to give spoilers for the series in general. There might be mild spoilers, but not major ones. Specifically, there won't be any for Wind and Truth. There might be mild ones for the Stormlight Archive itself, but nothing too bad. So if you haven't ever read any of my books, you can probably still watch this and you'll be okay. How does it feel? So I grew up reading epic fantasy. It's my first love, the big epic fantasy. I like to do a lot of things. I heard from you that you've been reading quite a bit of Sanderson this year, and so there's some variety in there. But I always kind of knew I wanted to have my big cornerstone, my big epic. You don't grow up reading Robert Jordan without wanting to do that, right? And the Stormlight Archive is a 10-book series. This is book number 5 that I spent 10 years outlining earlier in my career. And book 5 is kind of a big important moment. So how does it feel? Well, number one, I am so relieved to have it done. Jumping into a Stormlight book is so much work. I love it, but man, it's a lot of work. Also, there's things I've been holding off telling fans because I don't want to give spoilers that I've been holding in since 2002. And so, I'm kind of excited for people to finally be able to read them.
I can't imagine what it would feel like to have all of this sort of rattling around inside of you and feeling like, oh my God, I want to tell people, or worrying, what if I accidentally said something? Yeah. That would be my fear, is like mentioning something offhand. And because your fans are like so organized and they know everything about everything, and there's like 15 Wikipedias at any given time, that something could slip out into the world.
Yeah, I worry about that too. I worry about... Though, you know what I worry about more? I don't worry as much about the spoilers. Like, sometimes they'll happen. I have a lot of beta readers. So far, we haven't had any major leaks, but I know that something like that could happen. I'm more worried about, so you spend 20 years building a series, and the first book came out in 2010. So 12 years of actually releasing, well, not 12, sorry, 14 years. Math off a little bit there. I was thinking 2002, so I had
time is not real, is something that I think about.
And so to do the books the way I do, I like explosive endings. I like endings where multitudes of threads come together, wrap up, and are incredible. To do that, you need to lay proper foreshadowing. 12, 14, 15, 20, depending on which versions of books you've read and things, of foreshadowing, done properly, will let people guess what's coming up. So the question is, how do you maintain a sense of surprise and maintain interest, maintain mystery, while at the same time also properly foreshadowing what's coming so that when it happens, it doesn't feel completely out of left field.
And as someone who has read these books almost back to back, which is a very rewarding feeling, but I don't know if I would say that that's the way you have to do it.
Yeah.
Listeners, you don't have to do what I did. You don't have to be crazy and try to read them all at once. You can, and I had a really good time doing it. But to watch all those threads come together, and there were definitely things where I was like, oh, I think this is what's going to happen, and it did. But there were also times where I was so sure something was going to happen, and it didn't. And that's just as satisfying for me to be like, oh yeah, there's another surprise in there.
You want a balance. The perfect reading experience for me is a mix of some things you want to have happen that you notice clues for, and you get really satisfied with the payoff. There are some things, and this is what I really shoot for the bulk of, that when you're reading, you get an inkling of what's going to happen just a couple pages before, so that you have that gasp and then it hits, and that's kind of the 1-2 punch. And then you want some false flags, some places where you're sure I'm going some way, but then it twists. But here's the thing, twists are easy. Satisfying twists are hard. Anyone who's writing can do a twist. All they need to do is say, and then they all died, right? Easiest thing in the world. And then he decided this. Easiest thing in the world. Making that twist satisfying. Not a twist for twist's sake, but the classic writing adage of surprising yet inevitable. Those are what I really shoot for. And I want you to have those moments in books because that's my favorite type of plotting. Books are really three things. They're world building, they're plotting, they're character. And plotting is only one piece of it. If you don't have the other two, then the book is going to be lacking in some ways. But as plotting goes, that's what I want.
I love that you brought up all three of those things because I find all of that so prevalent in your work that there is this incredible combination of those three. And plotting, as far as this series goes, is such a big piece because it is action-packed. There is so much going on, but there's so much emotion behind it. And by the time you get through the very first book, towards the end, I mean, you're hooked no matter what because of this incredible plot. But my favorite piece is the characters. Without the characters of this series, right. I mean, it would be something completely different. And I think the voices that you are able to create and these people that we come to love, that is what is the heart of Stormlight for me.
So it's really interesting. I'm a fantasy writer. Fantasy is known for its world building. If it's on a shelf in the fantasy section, it's because of the world building. But of those three pillars, world building is actually the least important, and characters the most important. And granted, you want to be good at all three, right? Like I said before. But if you had to have one fail, a book with excellent characters and weak world building, still usually an excellent book. And a book with weak characters and excellent world building, it's an encyclopedia entry. It's not a novel. And so there's this kind of weird push and pull where the fantasy ideas are kind of how you market. It's kind of what puts you on a shelf. It's what makes you distinctive. I'm known for my magic systems and my world building with an eye toward science. Science influenced fantasy, if you want to call it that. At the end of the day, though, magic is only as interesting as the people who are using it. Magic is a tool for character drama. It is not an end unto itself. And so the skill I feel like I wanted to practice most as a new writer was the ability that my favorite authors were able to do, which is make viewpoints distinctive from one another. That when you pick up and are reading who a character is, you know their motivations, the way they see the world, and it reads differently. The diction is different. The way they think is different. George Martin is just, the absolute master of this. He's the gold standard. And that's the skill that I think really makes a big epic fantasy sing, because if every character feels the same, it's going to feel repetitive and boring. You need each character's thread to be doing different things, have different motivations, different reasons, different heart, different emotion. And that's tough. That's what makes these books so much work.
And I feel like as you read through, I mean, you start with a pretty core group and it just expands and expands and expands to a point where now we're getting so many viewpoints and it has just really grown. But when you started with that core group, was there a voice that came to you first? Was there a way that you started to get into those heads?
Yeah, good question. So the Stormlight Archive has an interesting history. I told you that it's been since 2002. Well, that's because in 2002, it's actually a little bit before that it started. So somewhere around 2000, I started working on a book called The Way of Kings. I now call that book The Way of Kings Prime. It did not get published. It actually was a failure. What happened is I tried to do all the viewpoints and all the plot lines from the beginning, from book one. I had been reading some really complicated, cool, giant epics that I loved, and the book failed because it didn't manage to give you payoff to any one story. It only gave you the first bit of 10 different stories. And those 10 years that followed, 2002 to 2010, really I was fixated upon this book and this series, and I'm like, what did I do wrong? How can I do it right? And, the secret is not that hard to figure out. It's what everybody else has done. It's what Tolkien did. It's what Robert Jordan did. It's what Anne McCaffrey did, which is start with a small, interesting core cast. Then let the people who are around them begin to develop and expand themselves and add characters slowly so that as a reader, you're always getting to know someone new, but you're also able to rely on your expertise from previous stories. And so when I rebuilt the Stormlight Archive, this is why I know it's 10 books, is because I took those 10 characters and I dedicated one book to each of their backstories. All of them are moving forward in time, but each book has a flashback sequence dedicated to one character. If you've ever seen Lost, it's the same thing that Lost did, except with me, it's one book, one character, rather than they would do an episode on one and another and then back to the first and things like that. This is kind of a classic storytelling thing that I could take a different way because I'd never seen a book series do it with each book having that dedicated flashback sequence. And of all of the characters in Prime, the character that spoke to me the most was Dalinar. But the character who was in Kaladin's place did not work at all. His character didn't work. And I spent those next 8 years kind of reworking this character and coming up with Kaladin to the point that he kind of became the heart because he's the first book. He's the flashback sequence in the first book. And all the characters are equally important in the overall scheme of things. But Kaladin became that through line, particularly through these first 5 books of we're watching Kaladin's story build upon itself from that initial seed in the first book. So I would say in the actual writing, Kaladin's the voice that I needed to get right the most, and I was most interested in making sure worked because I already knew Dalinar worked. And Shallan needed some work, but not as much as Kaladin from the original draft. She was in there mostly like herself.
Yes, I can see how Dalinar was always himself. I don't know, he just has that way about him where you're like, he was there.
He was the first idea I ever had for this series. The first thing that I ever thought of that became the Stormlight Archive was the idea of, so you're the brother of the king. The king gets assassinated, and your nephew takes over, and your nephew's a bad king. The question becomes then, what do you do? If you're Dalinar, and your nephew, you love your nephew, but he's a bad king. Do you step in? Do you do it for him? Do you let him fail? It's really, so the secret is, fantasy is not about the past. Science fiction is not about the future. They're both about the now. They're both about authors exploring the world. And Dalinar's story is that same story that I think every parent has to deal with, which is, when do I do things for my kids? When do I let them fall on their face? Add to that, your kid, if they fall on their face, could cause the collapse of the kingdom. Even if you're not a parent, you can understand this loyalty to family versus duty to, your job or your kind of own self, and the clash between those two and the way that kind of twists you about. That's what stories are about, right? That's what stories are. And yes, they're kings and it's all cool and there's really interesting magic. And this is a world where a magical storm, a hurricane, just the most powerful hurricane that we would get in our world would be a normal occurrence to them every few days. How does all ecology evolve in an environment like that? How does humankind adapt to living on a world like this? How do you survive it? And yes, that's the world building element. But the story is, what do you do if your nephew's bad at his job and you just want to fix it for him?
I love that no matter what happens in these books, there are both the giant capital T troubles, but everyone is also experiencing their own struggles, their own things they're trying to overcome, their own growth. Yeah. And I think I know we're only technically on book 5, that's halfway, but seeing the arcs and seeing the growth in these characters and our own growth along with them. I mean, there are characters where I maybe didn't love them when we started, but now I'm starting to be like, I'm actually on board. For me, that was Adolin. At the start, he was not my fave. But now we're coming along, he and I. We're building a bond.
It is interesting because on one hand, this is only halfway, but the other hand, I plotted it as the kind of a major kind of endpoint in the 10-book arc. It's broken into 2 sets of 5. There'll be a break-in world of about 10 years, and we'll come back to the books probably realistically 6 to 8 years, probably closer to 8. And in world, it will some time will have passed and things like that. The story's still going, but we're getting a little time jump. And so it's actually a really good place to start reading the books if you wanted to, because 5 is a major endpoint. You mentioned, the big capital T troubles and the troubles in our lives. This is why I write fantasy. So I'm an unlikely fantasy writer. I feel like every author says that they're an unlikely author. But I was not a big reader when I was younger. A lot of my friends, they finished their first book when they were 3, and they were, they published poetry when they were 5. I fell in love with reading in high school. I had a teacher, it was actually middle school technically, it was at the end of my 8th grade year, give me a fantasy novel. And the thing about fantasy is it worked for me in the same way that my kids like smoothies with spinach in them. If you try to feed my kids spinach, you will not get very far. But if you instead are making a smoothie and you're like, oh, and we put this in and it makes it green like zombie guts, then they will eat that smoothie because the spinach isn't there to be healthy. It's just the zombie gut coloring. When I was reading these fantasy books as a young person, I realized that I was getting theme and character and seeing through the eyes of people very different from myself, which is really hard to do when you're 15, see through someone else's eyes. The book that got me into this was a book about a woman having a midlife crisis. It made me a fantasy reader. It's called Dragonsbane. And you would think, how do you get a 15-year-old to read a book about a middle-aged woman going through a midlife crisis? Because, man, that book was so useful for me to understanding other people. Well, the answer is you put some dragons in it. You make it a cool fantasy story where you get to have fun, and there's capital T troubles, and then you dig into the really deep, interesting, personal stories of the characters involved. This is why we love Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings wouldn't work if it were Beowulf. Tolkien was a Beowulf scholar, and he loved Beowulf, but when he chose to write his series, he put the relationship between two normal people, Sam and Frodo, at the front and center and the heart of the story, and the difficulty that Frodo had being the one who had to bear so much, and the difficulty Sam had in being loyal to someone who, if you really look at it, is undergoing some mental health problems and being kind of difficult to be a friend to. And how do you be a friend to someone who's undergoing some mental health problems and support them without, you can't carry that ring for him, Sam. You can't take his mental health problems for yourself. Sometimes you can carry him. That's what the story is about. That's what Lord of the Rings is. But we also get a giant awesome war. We get Aragorn being cool. We get wizards. We get really interesting depth of lore and world building. Like, it's not just all rule of cool. It's this. There's such a wonderful package there with those intimate personal stories, and that's why I write fantasy. I always say, why would I write anything else when fantasy you can do anything you can do in any other genre, but you can also have dragons.
I'm here for the Anne McCaffrey rep. That was also my introduction to epic fantasy.
So good.
Yep. I remember being in 5th grade and playing games with my friends where the threads were coming down and we were dodging them. So
such a great story. I think Anne McCaffrey is not read as much now as she used to be, and I think that's criminal because I've read them recently. They hold up so well. Her writing is beautiful. She's got a real grasp of language. But beyond that, you think of what a fantasy book is, and you're going to think, oh, person goes on a quest, finds a magic sword. No, her story's person versus nature. There's a giant cataclysm coming, and we need to survive it. And the way we survive it is through magical means. But it's more a story about what do we do when our climate is undergoing a very dangerous change. And the fantastical solution there is dragons. Stuff is falling from the sky that will leave us all destroyed. We better get the dragons to burn it away as it falls. The antagonist, the primary antagonist, is not someone in a tower with an eye that searches for the ring. It is instead nature itself, which is so cool. I love that fantasy can approach so many different types of stories. And I think that people who are not experienced with the genre perhaps don't realize the depth that that fantasy stories can reach.
There are so many books that I feel like have shaped that for me and for my friends when we talk about epic fantasy. And to have something that is able to tell stories that really connect with us and to have issues that are very similar to things that are going on in our world. But if you just change a few things, it's so much easier to get a lens into really seeing what we can do. And it's a little bit easier and a little less painful sometimes than looking at things through that contemporary lens.
It is. It is. Not to say that contemporary books can't be awesome and that there's so many good ones right? But the special skill that we have in fantasy is to be able to take that few steps away that lets you as a reader maybe take some of your, baggage that you want to set down for a little bit, set it down and approach it in a new way. And, see it through the eyes of someone different and maybe through the eyes of someone like yourself, but experiencing something so difficult and terrible that you get a chance to kind of, in effigy, experience it yourself. A lot of people, and this is not me being smart, it's other smart people being smart. Psychologists and scholars talk about reading why we seek stories so much as human beings. And there's the argument, very good one, that what it does is it lets us practice emotions and responses in a safe way. We get to see what it's like to go through something so that maybe when we go through something similar, we've already built a few of those coping mechanisms. And I love to think that is what fiction does. I know it's done it for me. Absolutely.
I think that being able to gain empathy, to gain understanding is something that fiction offers us that few things do. I think even movies and TV, there's a window there, but I think something about having to build it in your mind, to read it, to feel it in that way connects us so much deeper, especially when we're doing epic fantasy and we're talking about things like right and wrong and honor and truth, like we come across in Stormlight so very much. There are definitely times where I sit and go, okay, like what would I do? Yeah. How would I feel? And sometimes it is completely different than the way the characters responded, but sometimes I'm like, oh, I know exactly what that feels like. And it's that comfort of being like, okay, I don't feel alone in that moment.
That's why we do it, to explore the world. At least that's why I do it.
And like you said, it is fun when there's also big giant battles and creatures and magic. And getting to see some of those things, your work really runs the gamut from all kinds of magic systems. I think if I was just talking to someone recently about magic systems and how sometimes they can be very daunting and sometimes they can be oversimplified. And I think finding that balance between sometimes you just drop us in and you go, I'm going to let you sit for a second with this. And then finding those creative ways to explain. I think Navani is one of my favorite characters for helping us understand the world. Right. Through her eyes, it's so much fun to watch how everything works together. But it is sort of that difficult balance of you need to have some things shown and some things told.
Yep, it really is. Like I tell my students that the grand skill of writing fantasy in particular is the ability to world build through the eyes of the characters subtly and carefully so it never reads like that encyclopedia article. That doesn't mean that once in a while you don't need two characters who are very knowledgeable about something to have a conversation about it. There always needs to be something else going on, and most of the time you want to get this across as a light brushstroke here and a light brushstroke there, though it really does depend on the book. And you experience this reading them all. The way I approach magic in Mistborn is very different from the way I approach it in Stormlight. In Mistborn, you don't get your explanations for how things work, and you don't really see people using it until pretty far in. And Mistborn is about a young woman who's recruited into a gang of thieves because they want to rob the Dark Lord, right? It's like if Danny Ocean were going to rob Voldemort, is basically what's going on in Mistborn. And because of that, I wanted to slowly initiate her into that world and slowly initiate you into it and not overwhelm you. Stormlight, in the prologue, it's like, here's the magic, deal with it. Because it's a giant 100,000 word book, 400,000 word, 1,000 pages and 400,000 words. It's just enormous. I want you to know up front if this book is for you. And if grasping some world building that you're thrown straight into is not for you, that's okay. But that's what we're going to do in this book. It's not what I do in Trust of the Emerald Sea, and it's not what I do in Mistborn, both of which have their own pretty intricate magic systems.
And getting to sort of collect the pieces that cross over between all the books is probably the best part of reading all of them. Mm-hmm. And maybe even I would say the best part of reading all of them in quick succession is it's so fresh when I see names or places. And I think especially as we're getting farther into Stormlight, the connections that are starting to be made. Again, I won't spoil anything, but the connections are really soaring, I would say, at this point. And getting to not only have all of that and to have it grow our appreciation and our joy while we're reading, but also then to sit back and be like, what is going on in this man's head? It is so much fun.
It is. So do you know where this came from? Have you ever heard this story? I love giant epics. I've talked about that. But when I was trying to break in, the advice I was getting over and over was send in standalones. Don't start an epic, which was pretty good advice for a new author, right? Main reason being, like, editors, like readers, want to know you can finish something before they don't want to get one part of a story. They want to get a whole story. Now, the actual solution is, writers out there, try to write your first book so it stands on its own, even if you're launching it into a series. Make sure you give us a good payoff so that we know, okay, this person can tell a story and they can end a story. But I was getting all of that, so I'm like, well, I really like big epics. What if I started hiding Easter eggs between my books to indicate that there's a bigger story going on so I can scratch that epic itch while at the same time doing all these submissions of standalones? Turns out one of those sold, and then I realized, well, I'm having so much fun with this, I'm going to do it for real. And so they stopped kind of being Easter eggs and became the real canon when I went and revised and then wrote Mistborn. But I always want to make sure that people don't feel like they have to read everything to understand the book they're in. And now people respond to that by saying, but Brandon, there's so many crossovers now. And I'm like, yes, they've always been there. I just hadn't written the books yet. If you go back and read Elantris, the first book I released, they're all in there because of the type of person I am. You just don't know it yet. And you were able to enjoy that book and not feel overwhelmed because there was nothing else there. You can read Stormlight and never have read any of the other books that some of the things in Stormlight connect to, and it will work just as well. Now, if you like the connections, they're their own fun thing, which you mentioned. You can read the other books and be like, hey, this character has some back history in this book that connects over here. For those who don't know, I call this the Cosmere. It's they're all separate planets with their own magics, but they're interconnected in some very interesting ways with people being able to get between them.
I'm what I call a rabbit hole reader. Okay. That once I pull on a thread, I've got to know. And so for me, starting a universe like this, starting a series of books, that was always very daunting to be like, because I know myself and because I know so many of your readers are like this too, that they have to know everything and they want they want to know it all. And so I was always like, okay, once I start, like I have to be ready because I'm going to have to just plow through the whole thing. And so I set myself a challenge when I knew Wind and Truth was coming out. I was like, this is the perfect time. And I think for so many readers that are unsure about fantasy, they're not sure if it's for them or they're not sure how to start. I think now is a great time because there's such a great it's almost like a renaissance in
this is the best
fantasy.
Time in fantasy. And I don't say that's going to sound arrogant, but no, we have some of the coolest things happening in fantasy ever. What you got to remember is fantasy's a new genre. It's probably, in some ways it's the oldest genre because, Beowulf and things like that. In some ways, the idea of a completely secondary world for fantastical stories to take place in, like, we don't really see that till Tolkien. We have a lot precursors of people from our world going to a fantasy world, or This is the prehistory of Earth. Really, even if you take those and you're like, the first of these start to pop up in the late 1800s. And really, this genre didn't get popular until Tolkien and until the 80s. We didn't have our first fantasy bestseller, I believe, until the 80s. And so the fact that the genre is young, and I always call Tolkien Grandpa Tolkien because I feel like I'm the third generation of fantasy writer. I grew up reading the people who were deeply influenced by Tolkien. And this generation, this third generation of fantasy writers, you feel kind of getting out from Tolkien's shadow. We've got people like N.K. Jemisin, which, just beautiful, wonderful stories. Very Ursula Le Guin, but with, her own thing, that are as literary, you can put those on the shelf next to Cormac McCarthy and they'll hold their own, right? You have stuff like Joe Abercrombie, which, if you want to smile and then be horrified from one page to the next, if you want some of that classic heroic fantasy, from the old days, taken and modernized with cleverness and wit, you got Joe Abercrombie. And those are two sort of books that are pretty opposite in a lot of ways, and yet they're both fantastic, and they're both happening right now. And you still have George writing, slowly, very slowly. But George is kind of the George R.R. Martin. When I say George, you still got George, who's of the generation before us, the Grand Master of that generation, and some other people like Robin Hobb, still writing from that generation, who are doing just wonderful things as they kind of, it's just a wonderful time to be in the fantasy world. And then you've got the whole romantasy side, which I haven't even dabbled in, which is like, boom, it's its own thing. It's an exciting time. The genre's evolved and developed so much in the last 20 years while I've watched it, that I feel very happy. I don't know if I could have sold books in the 70s because of the way that I approach it, but now not only can I get to kind of be at the head of some of these trends, which is pretty fun.
And I think for so many of my fellow readers who grew up sort of in amongst all this changing fantasy, from reading Tolkien to reading N.K. Jemisin now to reading, the Shadow of the Gods, like John Gwynne, all that all has been so much fun over the last few years to get into. But I'm still seeing like there is always going to be hesitancy with some people and starting genre fiction, even though I will extol my loves of genre fiction up and down, from horror and thriller to fantasy. And I wonder if you have anything to say to some of those people that are hesitant.
Well, the first thing to say is, if you have books you love and you're reading them, there's too many good books out there to read. So there's no need, right? I'm happy that you have books that you're loving, right? Read them, enjoy them. But if you want to try fantasy in particular, the thing I would point out to you is that we use genre too many different ways, right? And it makes the word kind of hard to define. And genre, when I was in college, the genres were prose, screenplay or playwright, poetry, and creative nonfiction, right? When they used genre, they didn't talk that it was a completely different thing. Sometimes when you say genre, you're like, this is a genre film, this is a hard-boiled detective film. And those have certain tropes that need to be there or it won't feel like a hard-boiled detective. Fantasy is not that. Fantasy is just the genre where you can do anything. It is therefore the biggest genre. And the people who have said, oh, I don't know if I want to try fantasy, there are fantasy stories you've loved, I guarantee. Hamlet is fantasy, right? I don't know that if Beowulf is. I define personally fantasy, the dividing line is if the author knew they were writing something that is fiction, right? And that's the dividing line for me. But there is something in fantasy. Everything from other genres ends up in fantasy. We do it. And that doesn't always go in the reverse. And so if what you love is a good historical epic, there are fantastic fantasy historical epics. Go ahead and try reading Guy Gavriel Kay, right? If what you love is a fantastic mystery, well, guess what? We've got some really great mysteries in fantasy. If you like romance, well, you probably already know about Fourth Wing and ACOTAR, right? Court of Thorns and Roses. I should say it out loud rather than the acronym. Right? If what you like is literary fiction, well, we've already mentioned Nora and Kate Jameson, right? And there's a whole gambit of, go pick up Perdido Street Station, check out Jane Wolfe. We can do everything. Plus, we're going to add that little extra sauce of some world building that's going to force you to stretch a little bit. But it's good. It's crunches for your imagination. That's really helpful. And you'll find that one of the reasons people love fantasy so much is spending a little time with that extra world building, going to that extra place, does something cool for your brain and your mind and your attachment to a story. It makes you want to go back in ways that sometimes other genres don't quite scratch that itch. So yeah, if you want to give us a try, look for what you love in books and then find a fantasy that kind of does some similar things but also takes its own way. Find a nice bookseller. They will pitch you a good book. There's so much to love in this genre. And it doesn't have to be intimidating. If you're intimidated by this, I've got a great story called The Emperor's Soul. It's that big, a little more literary. And self-contained. Go pick that up. Give that a try.
I also say for anyone who is feeling any sort of hesitancy, the audiobooks for your books are some of the best. That's absolutely what has helped me get through this. Michael and Kate feel like personal friends of mine now because of all the time I've spent with them. I love
Michael and Kate. I asked for them by name when they started doing my audiobooks because I'd love their readings of The Wheel of Time. And they are fantastic. They're really easy to work with. They are great. And so, Michael and Kate are amazing. If you're hesitant, Michael Kramer reads Trust of the Emerald Sea very well, and I can point that one as a good place to start also.
I agree. I think that there is so much to love, not only in your works, because there is, but in fantasy as a whole. It just gives us so much, and there is such a great community behind it as well.
Yeah.
I think the community of fantasy readers is so strong and welcoming. I have loved getting to, even on social media, interact with people and to see the creativity, especially among the Cosmere fans. I mean, the creativity and the love that they have for this series is incredible.
They're what make me able to do this, right? Without them, I'd have to be like an insurance salesman somewhere. No shade at insurance salesmen. We need you guys, but I would waste away in a cubicle. And because of the fans, instead of being in that cubicle, I've been writing in a hammock lately. Set up a hammock,
Luxury.
Look at the mountains, sit outside, swing, and back and forth while I'm working on stories. That's what I get to do because of those wonderful people. So I appreciate them so very much.
I love that. I have a few questions that I feel like I have to ask because of my immersion in the Cosmere. I had dreams on Roshar. I need you to know that. Are there any characters in the Cosmere that are your absolute favorite to write? And then are there some that are the biggest challenge to write?
So can I steal Robert Jordan's answer to this very question when he was asked about the Wheel of Time? He said, my favorite is whoever I'm writing now.
I guess that's fair.
And they kind of have to be, right? Mm-hmm. When you're writing through their eyes, they can't afford to be anything but your favorite. I can tell you that the bigger books are more difficult because you have to switch characters so often. And that does mean that sometimes, so what's harder to write? Writing a character who is witty and smart is harder than writing one that's not. One of the hardest characters, scenes to ever write are scenes that wit is in. But, Wayne is also very hard to write because if they have to be smarter than me, a lot of intelligence is just based down to how quickly you can come up with things, right? Factoid that people love to hear is my college roommate, a man named Ken Jennings, right? He won Jeopardy. He's now the host. Hanging out with Ken, I understood what intelligence is, and it's the having that brain that can instantly recall and pull out something or instantly come up with a quip or pun, just right like that. And writing those people, I take 20 minutes to come up with what they come up with off the cuff. And that can be tough. That's a challenge. You're like, this one isn't quite good enough for wit. Then you have to scrap it and go back and do another one. That's the hardest thing when you're like, oh, I've got it. And then in the shower, you're thinking, no, that's too pedestrian an insult. And you have to go back and come up with a new one.
I think that's fair. I think it's also, I mean, just the same as I imagine most of your readers would not have a great answer for which characters they love the most, because every time you think of one, you think of 7 more that you wish you could have said. So I think that that's fair. And we have talked a little bit about influences thus far, but I would love to, as a bookseller, talk a little bit about some of your biggest influences, both as a reader and writer, and some things that you'd like to recommend.
Okay. So a lot of my influences are older, right? That isn't to say that there aren't fantastic writers writing right now. Like I'm reading Fonda Lee right now, and she's amazing. Don't look at this as, but a lot of your influences are framed by what you read when you first are starting in as a writer. And I try now to read what's doing very well and that I like and be like, what can I learn from this person, right? But my deepest influences are, I usually kind of hold up 3. The first is Les Misérables, my favorite classic, right? You'll find some of the themes and ways of storytelling from Les Mis showing up. Victor Hugo, really like his writing. I like even the boring parts of other people. I'm the same way with Melville. I wouldn't count him as a huge influence, but the parts of Melville people are bored by, I'm like, no, that's the cool stuff. The second one would be Anne McCaffrey. I'm never disappointed when I pick up an Anne McCaffrey book. And then the third one's pretty obvious. It's The Wheel of Time, our influences. But there's some other smaller ones that might be more interesting to talk about because we haven't mentioned them. One of them is Watchmen. Watchmen is, a masterpiece. It's everyone knows this. Everyone's aware of this, but and it made a splash when it came out. Even then, even back. And reading Watchmen, the thing that changed storytelling for me, 2 things from Watchmen. Number 1 is the use of literary metaphor and literary styling while also telling a story about a bunch of superheroes. So interesting. The story of the Black Freighter, where a person sails upon, the corpses of his fellows, where the society is built on the corpses of those who died, building it as a metaphor. And, it's a pirate story and it's a superhero story and all that. I mean, that's why Watchmen is Watchmen, right? It's just mind-blowingly interested in its use of those things. But also, the one that's most obvious you can see is his use of what we call ephemera. When you read Watchmen, at the end of an issue, you'll have an insert that is like, and here is the actual, toys that one of the characters in-world is selling. They're not actually toys you can buy. It's an advertisement in-world, and it's like got the notations on one of the characters saying, well, the toys based on this character should be more like this, and that artifact is something actually Tolkien did too. When you read Lord of the Rings and you see the map is the map they had, right? The map is an in-world artifact, Bilbo wrote The Hobbit, and Bilbo, illustrated and things like that, his own book. And that carried over when I started the Stormlight Archive in particular. I said, I want this. As Watchmen would do this, usually with text, you'd have an excerpt from someone's biography. I want to do this with art. I want my art to all be in-world art. I want you to have scraps of it. We don't use enough art in books anymore. In the old days, you always got illustrations, and now, illustrations for kids. Some of the coolest pieces of art we get are those wood blocks and things like this, like the ones from Paradise Lost that I still love. So we want to do things like that. So when you read Stormlight Archive, it'll mention a map, and then a few pages later is the map. It's like drawn on a shell, and it's the actual one someone was carrying to get around. The art pieces are in-world pieces of lore, and we put like 40 of them in every book, every Stormlight book, because it's just one of my artistic choices for the stories. And we do some really fun. Have you read this one yet? Do you get an arc? Did they give you the arc? Okay.
So you got an actual arc. So you got to see, no spoilers, but you got to see some of the cool things we do with art of this that I've been waiting to have a chance to do, just to kind of how art influences narrative and how art can add the package of a book, influence the experience is something I'm fascinated by.
I love that. I have one final question that I love to ask people. Do you have a sort of perfect reader that would come across like a Brandon Sanderson table in a Barnes & Noble in a store? Someone that you're like, this is absolutely the person that I hope finds this book.
I'm not sure if I do. There's a couple comments I get from readers, and I assume these are common things that are answered to this question. I love it when I find someone who's like, comes to me and says, I used to love fantasy, went to college, read a whole bunch of textbooks, fell out of reading. Then later on, I found your books and it reminded me of what I love about this genre. That really resonates with me because I know we lose a lot of readers during college for obvious reasons. But I always love when the reader is looking like the young reader, that reader that I was when I was 14 or 15, and a teacher gave me a book and said, read this. And it changed my life. Reading Dragonsbane. Thank you, Ms. Reader. That was her real name. I'm hoping I can reach those people at whatever age. They're like looking for something to find themselves in. Like I found myself in the novels that I read when I was younger.
I love that. And I think there's so much in all of your work that will really connect and really bring people in. And so thank you so much for doing this. Wind and Truth is out now, but if you're like me and you want to get your hands on something more, Mistborn, the earlier books in Stormlight, The Secret Projects, they're also great. So thank you so much.
And Barnes & Noble, we signed copies just for Barnes & Noble. Do you know this? They're probably all gone by now, but I signed thousands of them. So we appreciate you, Barnes & Noble booksellers.
Thank you so much.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Wind and Truth. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by one of my all-time favorite booksellers, and really, I think, our biggest Brandon Sanderson fan in maybe the company. This is Erin. Hello. So we're going to recommend a couple of wonderful high fantasy books / series that you can dig into if you are just really waiting for something new from Sanderson. We've got some things to tide you over. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. Thank you. So if you're looking for something that really builds a beautiful world, builds a beautiful magic system, has prose that just sings, very similar to Sanderson, I've got your back. I want to recommend The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book of an epic trilogy called the Broken Earth series. It won the Hugo and Nebula Awards for the first and second books in the series. I think that's the first time that's happened. Probably definitely the first time it's happened from a female author. Most definitely from a female author of color. So a lot of things going for it, and for very good reason. It's so good. I can't say a whole lot about the plot, but essentially it follows three women who play a very important part in a cataclysmic magical event that really just does a lot to the world. The twist is so amazing that I really can't say much more than just read it. It's beautiful. It combines high concept fantasy, detailed world building without too much exposition, excellent characters, really fantastic prose, and I love the way that she uses these lovely brushstrokes of culture and infuses them into her storytelling. Jemisin is a genius, and this book is the thing that I think will cement that in any reader's heads and hearts. So check out The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Erin, what do you have for us?
I actually want to recommend the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. Obviously, you've probably heard of the video games or the TV show, and those are great, but the novels are really a treat unto themselves. The series follows Geralt of Rivia, the titular Witcher, a mutant mercenary for hire as he tries to make his way and navigate through a dark world of magic, politics, monsters. He's just a simple man trying to make a living, and he's having a hard time doing it. But it is a beautiful, rich, and detailed fantasy world with its own unique magic system, which really harkens back to Sanderson's systems. And it follows a sometimes problematic main character who really experiences growth and change throughout the story and becomes more and better than he was. The setting is more Eastern European than out there fantasy world, but the lore and the history and the world building is just as deep. It also similarly kind of follows a parallel world, other universe thing that we've seen in Sanderson's Cosmere and World Hopping, which I feel like doesn't get looked at enough. And like, it's popular, but it's popular for a reason, and it's because it changes just enough about that high fantasy stereotypical genre to kind of keep things fresh and fast-paced and interesting, and you're just going to want to read more.
Oh, absolutely. Could not agree more. I think that series just does something very special, and there are ways to dip into it without feeling too overwhelmed. There's a short story collection that you can sort of start with if you just want to get into his beautiful writing style, or just dive right into the series and come back later. Regardless, yes. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark, and this is Erin. You can follow us at our home store at BN Westchester. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.